Plonk yourself down into Central Europe and look around. Who's the most influential nation? It seems so obvious, right? No, it's not Czech Republic or Slovakia, previously Czechoslovakia, despite their European Championship win in 1976. It's not Yugoslavia, despite all the terrific football they brought to the world throughout the 1960s and 90s. It's not even Hungary, despite the 1954 World Cup final, the Magical Magyars, or all of the superb talent they've given the world, such as Ferenc Puskas. It's certainly not Switzerland, Poland, or Ukraine, despite their recent promise in numerous World Cups and Euros. And it's not Germany either. You'd have thought it would be, wouldn't you? They've got 4 World Cups to their name, 3 European Championship titles, and are indisputably the most successful footballing nation in European history. No, it's that country beneath them just there, little old Austria. Before Germany decided to get good at football, professionalize their game, and ascend to the top of Europe, Austria had had professional football for decades and had set the wheels in motion for the type of football we see on our screens today. You're thinking, how is that correct, and how dare this introduction and video title be so clickbait? Well, it simply isn't, and this film will explain just how influential Austrian football has been and why we have Austria and not Germany to thank for the beautiful game we know and love today. The big cities of the Habsburg Empire shaped much of continental Europe's first football. The empire encapsulated large parts of modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. So therefore, it wasn't a surprise that once football had infiltrated the dying empire, it clung onto cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Prague like a rash. In Vienna, the pastimes of horse riding and gymnastics were popular until football came along and blew them out of the water. Typically, the English were the first to play football in what is now the Austrian capital. Employees of British companies based in Vienna delivered the football to Austria, and in 1894 both First Vienna and Vienna Cricket and Football Club were born. Whilst the latter relied solely on English players, they would soon allow Europeans in, and one of the first stars of Austrian football, Ludwig Husak, plied his trade for the club. Just 6 years after the first 2 clubs were inaugurated, 45 football clubs played in Vienna, with 17 of those joining the OFU, the first official Austrian football association. It was only a matter of time before the first international match was played, the first between 2 non-British teams, as Austria thrashed Hungary 5-0. The Viennese dominance over Hungary would remain so for a while, further rubber-stamped with another thrashing the subsequent year. It was Johann Studnicka who netted hat-tricks in both games for Austria. As such, Austrian football's first star was born. The OFU would be dissolved into the OFV in 1904, before finally evolving into its current guise of the OFB 22 years later, by which point it was evident that the sport had spread in similar ways to what it had done in Britain. The game started off in public schools before flexible working laws made it only a matter of time before the masses of the working class seized upon the game. An interwar period of mass unemployment in Austria had only driven the popularity of the sport. This, combined with lower ticket prices and the professionalization of the sport, made football a realistic opportunity as a career. The only difference being that whilst in England, one of the main drivers for this was this man, Hugo Meisel, the Napoleon of Austrian football, according to his brother. Meisel was born in Malešov in Bohemia in 1881 to a Jewish family before moving to Vienna. Taken by football from an early age, he'd attempted to make it as a player, but when the realization came that it was no longer a possibility, he followed his father's wishes of a more commercial career by moving to Italy. Upon returning to Austria for his military service, Meisel teamed working for a bank with work in a number of roles for the Football Association, primarily as a referee. His most notable match was a 1907 international between Austria and Hungary, won 3-1 by the former. He lapsed into coaching and soon became the Secretary General of the Football Association, and soon enough working for Landesbank, Austria's first bank, was no longer the priority. Coaching the national team, Meisel was infuriated by a draw between Austria and Hungary in 1912, so he sought the help of referee James Howcroft. He told him in no uncertain terms that he needed help with his coaching, so he recommended his good friend Jimmy Hogan. With their predicated love for the Scottish school of football, Meisel and Hogan were bound from day one. With the power over tactics and selection, Meisel could appoint the Englishman. This is Jimmy Hogan, the son of a mill worker and devout Catholic. He embarked on a middling football career from Burnley and Fulham to Swindon and Bolton, an unremarkable player whose legacy would be long forgotten but remains intrinsically linked to the modern game. When Meisel courted Hogan, he was coaching students in Dordrecht at the young age of 28. The Netherlands School of Football was a learning curve for Hogan, as most of the work done was theoretical and performed in classrooms. Still, Hogan was a success, helping the Dutch national team defeat Germany 2-1. Whilst his ideals were more of a pragmatic nature than the intricate passing football that Austria would become well known for, Hogan and Meisel both trumpeted the ideals of the Scottish passing game and converged to lay down the blueprint for European football. Hogan was contracted to a 6-week contract where he worked with Austria's top football clubs and the national team. The main event, though, were the Olympic Games held in Stockholm in the summer of 1912. Both Hogan and Meisel had decided that the 2-3-5 was the preferred mode of attack, but the team had to be loosened up, made less rigid, and had to pass and move the ball a lot more. On the pitch, Johann Studnicka still led the team, as Austria hammered Germany 5-1 in their opening match before going out to the Jimmy Hogan-endorsed Netherlands 4-3 in the quarter-finals. In the subsequent consolation tournament, Austria reached the final. There was no way back onto the pitch now for Jimmy Hogan. His coaching career had taken precedent, particularly after a knee injury that had dwindled his already stark quality on the pitch. Sometime later, when Hugo Meisel learned of Hogan's application for the German Football Federation, he quickly reeled the Englishman back into a longer contract with the Austrian team. Hogan had already fallen in love with Vienna, so he agreed to take the national team ahead of the 1916 Olympics. He'd been advised by the British consulate that conflict in Europe was in the distant future, only for war to be declared a matter of days later. With the outbreak of the First World War, given Austria-Hungary's position in the conflict, Jimmy Hogan was interned in prison as a so-called enemy of the state. Whilst the American Council could aid his family's release, Hogan was eventually saved by 2 Englishmen who earned the coach's freedom by donating £1,000 to the Austrian Red Cross. Hogan would eventually return to Europe after the war in many guises as he kick-started the Hungarian game, worked in Switzerland and France too, as well as the odd flirtation with Austria. In his homeland, he was forgotten. His biggest achievement being a run to the FA Cup semi-final with Aston Villa in 1938. In regard to Austrian football, the 1920s were certainly roaring. Icons of the game began to become more frequent. Josef Uradil was revered for his robust style up front, and he was a success off the pitch too, fronting advertisement campaigns and appearing as a compeer in music halls. By the end of the decade, there was a clamour for a different type of striker, in step, Matthias Sindelar. The effervescent frontman was affectionately known as Der Pajarine and teamed a new creative style with both flair and spontaneity. Both strikers had become celebrities in their own right, but the similarities stopped there. One writer declared Uradil was a tank, while Sindelar was a wafer. It was true that a certain fragility constantly followed Sindelar around, ever since a knee operation in the middle part of the decade, which would become a recurring problem. Still, he made his debut for the national team aged 23 in 1926, but was never fully trusted by a conservative Hugo Meisel. Despite scoring on his debut, he was named in only one squad between 1928 and 1931. The Austrian game was the first on the continent to become professional, when Hugo Meisel's long fight for a proper Austrian football league was realized in September 1924. He felt the need to reimburse the players for their actions in a sport that had gripped Vienna. Whilst this saw to the end of Austrian involvement at the Olympic Games in the 1920s, luckily there were other advocates for the professionalization of the sport, notably the head of FIFA, Jules Rimet. Yet in the interwar years, money was sparse, and the perfect case study for this was Hakoah Vienna. Meaning strength in Hebrew, Hakoah was a Jewish football team founded by Fritz Lohner Beder and Ignaz Hermann Korner in 1909. They found promotion in 1920 thanks to English coach Arthur Gaskell, a friend of a certain Jimmy Hogan. Hakoah would win the inaugural season of the professional Austrian league, but realized they had bled their coffers dry. The team was effectively a collection of the brightest and best they could afford from all over Central Europe. With this popularity, teamed with recent successes in mind, Hakoah embarked on an American tour. They lit the fire underneath the Americans, popularizing football in the States, as well as setting foot on South American soil. Their reputation was such that they were nicknamed the Unbeatable Jews and taught several teams a lesson. However, it would prove the club's demise. Despite the great revenues gained from the tour of the Americas, they were swallowed up by the richer American teams that needed to pad out their inferior teams with more star quality. So, by the end of the tour, half of the Hakoah team had signed for football teams on the east coast of America. Whilst Austria was in the throes of hyperinflation, American teams could afford to pay players hundreds of dollars a week. They needed to find a way out of the financial hole, and Hugo Meisel masterminded the formation of both the Mitropa Cup and International Cup to combat it. The former was a multinational tournament between the clubs of Central Europe, the latter a version for the national teams of the same area. Not only did Meisel attempt to heal Europe's financial mess, but after his experiences on the front line, it was a dream of his to repair diplomatic relations in the region. In a football sense, Meisel had effectively created the forerunners for the Champions League and European Championships. In the early years, the Mitropa Cup was dominated by Austrian teams. Rapid Vienna reached the final in both 1927 and 1928 before finally winning the tournament in 1930. The trophy remained in Austria the following year, in the first all-Austrian final, when First Vienna defeated Wiener AC. This was in spite of the rising tide of Italian football, who were fully represented at the tournament. As the 1930s grew, so did Austrian football, as Matthias Sindelar led Austria Vienna to the Mitropa Cup in both 1933 and 1936, one of which came against Ambrosiana, who would become Inter Milan. Sindelar netted a hat-trick in the 1933 final, a player at the peak of his powers in the biggest possible club game on the continent. The Mitropa Cup was the perfect platform to showcase Sindelar as the greatest player on the continent. All he and Austria needed now was the perfect platform on the international stage. Jimmy Hogan might have fled Vienna, but the blueprint he had attached himself to remained under Hugo Meisel. Meisel returned to coach the national team on a full-time basis from 1919, managing them in 122 matches. His own creation, the inaugural International Cup, looked to have backfired on him, as Austria were defeated in 3 of the first 4 games. In a league format that also featured Czechoslovakia, Italy, Hungary and Switzerland, Austria recovered to thrash both Hungary and Italy. Despite performing a double over Italy, Meisel's team were a point behind them. FIFA had finally announced plans for the inaugural World Cup, only it was to be staged in Uruguay, so the best European teams were missing. Represented by Belgium, France, Romania and Yugoslavia, only the latter qualified out of the group stage. Austria, alongside many others, declined the invitation from FIFA. A shame, considering that Austria football was widely viewed as the best brand on the continent by the time Uruguay claimed the first World Cup. The following year, the first wunderteam was complete, as the clamour for Matthias Sindelar was paid off with his national team recall. After a 5-0 humiliation to a southern Germany team, Sindelar and Meisel clashed, and the player was ostracized from the team. Despite that disagreement, there remained a deep respect between player and manager, and Meisel knew full well that he could no longer ignore Sindelar's performances for his club. Even though the teenager Josef Bican was breathing down Sindelar's neck in the same position, and Meisel was tempted to throw the youngster in, Sindelar was trusted. In May 1931, Austria pricked the ears up of not only continental Europe, but Britain too, as they thrashed Scotland 5-0. Even though Scotland were without their old firm players, they were outclassed to such an extent that the whole of Europe now paid attention to Austrian football. They were unbeaten in their next 11 fixtures, only drawing 2, and that included an 11-0 aggregate score over Germany. This fresh streak of invincibility factored in the second edition of the International Cup. Austria had suffered a first matchday defeat in Italy, which liberated an Italian public that was stuck under the thumb of the Austrians in a footballing sense, having not recorded a victory against them in 9 attempts over 19 years. Yet they recovered, scoring 8 past Switzerland to end the year before Matthias Sindelar's double sank Italy in the reverse fixture in March 1932. A point in Czechoslovakia and another comfortable beating of the Swiss confirmed the title. It was here where they became known as Das Wunderteam. Right from Josef Smistik in defense to Sindelar up the other end of the pitch, Austria were officially now head and shoulders above all on the continent. This earned them the rare invitation from the esteemed England. Austria became the 3rd continental team to be invited to London, and it was Austria's biggest test thus far. Despite suffering a first defeat to continental opposition in Madrid 3 years prior, England had gained enough revenge over Spain with a reverse 7-1 win back home. The December 1932 fixture was carefully scheduled by the English, safe in the knowledge that the heavy conditions would thwart the delicate Austrian game. Arsenal manager Herbert Chapman had persuaded Racing Club de Paris to release Jimmy Hogan so he could assist Hugo Meisel for the fixture. Despite this, they fell to a 4-3 defeat. And yet, it was Austria receiving all the plaudits. Rightly so, as they had dominated the game despite the conditions. The Daily Mail called them a revelation, the Times awarded them the moral victory, and the Daily Herald named Sindelar as the best centre-forward on the continent. It marked the end of the first wunderteam. Fear not, the second was right around the corner. But before that, Austria returned to England, and what was officially known as a Vienna 11 were beaten again 4-2, this time by Arsenal. The Evening Standard launched into a criticism of the Austrians. When the Austrians have learned how to turn all their cleverness into something that counts, when they have organized the winning of football matches as highly as they have organized the taming of a football, they will make everyone sit up and take notice. Consequently, the game led English football further away from possession football for a few more decades. As English game lacked the aesthetic, the stereotype that Austria was more style than substance did carry a kernel of truth. Austria prepared for the 1934 World Cup, having lost just twice between May 1931 and 1934. But the prior year had been a year filled with friendly fixtures, the majority of them disappointingly drawn. In a time where the Viennese public were dismayed by a bad win, they were furious at a lack of victories. Just in time for the 1934 World Cup in Italy, Hugo Meisel had rejuvenated a second wunderteam that had won in Turin and Geneva in the International Cup, qualified for the World Cup comfortably against Bulgaria before thrashing Hungary in preparation for the tournament. The FIFA president marked out Italy as favourites, but admitted that Austria played the better brand of football. That brand continued as Meisel's 2-3-5 stood the test of time, even if the OFB couldn't afford to bring Jimmy Hogan on to assist the coach for the tournament. Meisel had taken to using both Sindelar and Josef Bican up front. This combined with the prolific Anton Schall, the speed of Karl Zizek, and the experience of Rudolf Wirtl. Austria were insatiable going forward. Despite this, they needed a slice of luck to progress into the quarter-finals, courtesy of an Anton Schall winner against France that had more than a whiff of offside about it. The next opponent was a familiar one, Hungary, in Bologna. Johann Horvath ran the game in midfield, scoring the first, but was ultimately ruled out for the remainder of the tournament through injury. What ought to have been a beautiful display of football stooped to the lows of a brawl. The better team and 2-1 winners, Austria progressed to the San Siro to meet the hosts, a match deemed as the final before the final. Whilst Austria had suffered a brawl, Italy had suffered through a tight replay against Spain 2 days prior. A cruel storm drenched Milan and the San Siro pitch became a bog, a fact that would hamper Austria's football and impact the overall quality of the game. Paired off with an opponent in Luis Monti, who used all methods to stop Zizek and Sindelar alongside home field advantage and a dash of kind officiating, Austria were always underdogs. Even then, Zizek had the chance to take it to extra time, but skewed a last-minute shot wide of the mark. Hugo Meisel criticized the endless foreign tours put on by cash-strapped Austrian clubs for his exhausted players, whilst others chose to blame the referees. Whilst it is true that their semi-final was officiated by a Swede, 12 of the other 24 referees for the championships were Italian. Also, the fact that Ivan Eklund was also promised to referee the final by the Italians might have sufficiently buttered him up. There is a mode of thinking that a fascist Italy would have never allowed another team to win a World Cup in Italy or anywhere, as the 1938 ordeal between the newly fascist Hungary all but allowed an Italian walkover and a second World Cup in a row. As Italy won the World Cup, Austria began a malaise, with fans critical of an international cup draw to World Cup finalists Czechoslovakia 4 months after the championships. Italy had found the middle ground between the European 2-3-5 and the English WWM with the Metodo system that teamed style and substance. They might not have been as pretty as Austria or Hungary and not quite as physical as England, but in borrowing a little from both, they found the perfect blend. Speaking of physicality, Sindelar was increasingly coming into question after a loss in Budapest after the World Cup. And with a poor 1935, where Austria won just one of 6 official matches, failing to keep hold of the International Cup, many were signalling the end of the second wunderteam. Until in May 1936, with conditions just right and with home field advantage attained, Austria claimed their biggest scalp in defeating England. Matthias Sindelar put in a performance as a withdrawn forward that foreshadowed the travails England would face a generation later against Hungary and Nandor Hidegukti. With one victory, Austria were dragged out of the doldrums. A third wunderteam was on the horizon, according to many, and then, less than a year after Austria's greatest triumph, Hugo Meisel died, only 55, from a heart attack, and Austria died along with him. Also dead, the dream of peace in Europe as the continent veered uncontrollably to a Second World War. Before that, the Anschluss had swallowed up Austria, and consequently, Austrian football no longer existed. Any player that had played for Austria was now only eligible for Germany, and suddenly, Austria's spot in the 1938 World Cup was gone. With their manager dead, their star player nearing the end of his career, there was a fear that Danubian football was fading with the collapse of Austria. The Anschluss effectively fast-tracked the demise, with the large Jewish populace housed in the coffee houses of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest quashed. Football became amateur again. Austrian teams were no longer allowed access to the Mitropa Cup, and the idea of the wunderteam was gone. German football was not as advanced as it was in Vienna, Prague, or Budapest. Schalke were the country's greatest team, and, like the wunderteam, were largely built on the foundations of Jimmy Hogan's brand of football. Nicknamed the Spinning Top, Schalke laid waste to the German championship, winning 9 of 10 titles between 1933 and 1942. World Cup semi-finalists in Italy after shunning the first tournament, Germany had the hosting of the Olympics ahead of them and a plan to rattle through the field at the subsequent 1938 World Cup in France. Only they were publicly embarrassed against Norway at their own Olympics, losing in what was said to be the only game attended by Adolf Hitler. Before the World Cup could be played, the reconciliation game between Germany and what was named an Ostmark 11 was scheduled for April 1938. Austria had lost large chunks of their second wunderteam. Anton Schall's cardiac issues stunted his game, whilst the likes of Josef Bican, Karl Zizek, Camilo Jerusalem, and Walter Nausch had all emigrated. With a game of such high emotions and political undertones, rumors continue to swirl around the fixture. Austrians were allegedly ordered not to score against Germany, yet still they dominated the first half. It was said that of Mathis Sindelar's numerous misses, each of which flashed just past the post, almost as if to prove a point that he could score if he was allowed to. If we're to cut through the conjecture, however, what is certain of the game is that both teams had peaks and troughs, and Sindelar eventually did score. He netted a rebound into an open net before Shasti Sesta curled in a free kick. If there were any orders of not to upset the Germans, and the 2 goals didn't see to that, then the picture of Sesta and Sindelar dancing in celebration in front of top Nazi officials surely would have. In a period of history such as this, where the truth gets muddied, rumors of who German manager Sepp Herberger could and couldn't select from the Austrian contingent continued. It was alleged he couldn't play a majority Austrian team, so decided it best to pick a fully Austrian front 5 with a German defensive unit. It made perfect sense, and that of the Austrians selected for Germany during Anschluss, 63% were forwards. Despite the most barbaric method in which to bring the transfer system to international football, Germany still found no glory at the World Cup, as they were eliminated in the first round by Switzerland. Of the Austrian squad, from the reconciliation game, only Matthias Sindelar refused the idea of playing for Germany, with 9 Austrians selected for their 22-man World Cup squad. Within 8 months of the final being played, Sindelar was found dead in the cafe he owned alongside his girlfriend. Once more, conspiracy dominated proceedings. Some dispute foul play, and some contend it was suicide, whilst few corroborate the official ruling of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. There are many reasons why the success of Austria didn't materialize into a third wunderteam. The death of Hugo Meisel and the annexation of Austria by Germany are the 2 primary factors. Before his death in 1937, Meisel had begun to craft his third wunderteam. Josef Bican was generally preferred to an aging Matthias Sindelar towards the end of the decade. Goalkeeper Peter Platzer was in his peak, aged 27, as were Sesta and Hisa in defense. Captain Josef Smistik and Walter Nausch brought enough experience in midfield, and the 1938 World Cup likely would have come down the three strongest powers, all from Central Europe. Eventual finalists Italy and Hungary, as well as Austria, who suffered a walkover from Sweden as a result of the Anschluss. The Austrian dream was over, yet it lived on in the guise of the Magical Magyars of Hungary, who went even closer to winning a World Cup than the Austrians when they got to the 1954 final. Whilst Austria were led by Ernst Ock-Werk and could boast another formidable team in the early 1950s, the 1954 edition of the World Cup simply came too late for them. Despite that, they did return to the semi-final for the second time thanks to a madcap 7-5 quarter-final win over hosts Switzerland. Ultimately, however, Austria's defense was found out against West Germany in the Final Four stage. Their goalkeeper wasn't strong enough, and more than half of West Germany's 6 goals on the day came from aerial situations. West Germany then went on to shock the world in Bern by defeating Hungary in the final. It took 9 full years for West German club football to be professionalized, with the advent of the Bundesliga in 1963. And 3 years beyond that, the nation returned to the biggest game in world football, albeit in defeat to England. This was just the beginning of a continent being laid under siege by West Germany with the threat of footballing world domination. Between 1972 and 1980, West Germany would participate in every European Championship final, defeating the Soviet Union and Belgium, either side of a narrow penalty shootout defeat courtesy of a cheeky Antonin Panenka attempt. By that point, however, West Germany were world champions again, this time upsetting another fan favorite in the total football-playing Netherlands on West German soil. Not satisfied with their stranglehold on the international game, which had them as double reigning champions of the world and Europe, West German teams began to win big in club football. The year West Germany claimed their second World Cup gold, Bayern Munich began their run of winning 3 European Cups in a row. Added to this were the great footballing teams of Borussia Mönchengladbach and Hamburger SV, who routinely found themselves competing in European Cup finals. There was one thing for Austrians to shout about, however, and they called it the miracle of Cordoba. After 20 years away from the world stage, Austria upset the odds by qualifying for the second group stage of the 1978 FIFA World Cup held in Argentina. Fate pulled neighbors Austria and West Germany for a final group game that, albeit meaningless in the grand scheme of the tournament, meant the world to both teams. Austria claimed the victory, thanks to a late Johann Krankel goal, and Austria had a first international victory over West Germany since September 1931. From the miracle of Cordoba to the disgrace of Gijón 4 years later, and an entirely different mood surrounded the 4th World Cup meeting between the pair. Austria, as expected, took maximum points from victories over Chile and Algeria, whilst West Germany had shockingly stumbled to Algeria in their opening game. With Algeria claiming their second World Cup triumph 8 days later against Chile, West Germany and Austria had a full 24 hours to concoct a plan that would see them both qualify. A West German win by either 1 or 2 goals would confirm the safe passage of both teams, and as soon as Horst Hrubesch scored after 10 minutes, the pace of the game ground to a glacial halt. The disgraceful scenes brought in simultaneous kickoff times in final group games, and whilst West Germany reached the final, both teams received their comeuppance. Since that particularly dark cloud, Austria have won just 1 World Cup game. A 2-1 victory over a poor USA team in 1990. They haven't been at a World Cup in the 21st century and haven't competed in a knockout game at the tournament since 1954. They only just managed to qualify for their first European Championships on merit when the tournament was expanded to 24 teams in 2016, after they had previously co-hosted the 2008 edition with Switzerland. Neither summer resulted in a win for the Austrians. In the interim, Germany have claimed 2 World Cups and 1 European Championships, as the landscape of football has drastically changed. With a select few teams in an even more select few nations fortunate enough to have the ability to compete in Europe, Austria have been left behind. Rapid Vienna's appearance in the 1996 Cup Winners' Cup final was the last occasion Austria were represented in a European final. They have had just 1 team qualify for the knockout stages of the Champions League since its 1992 rebranding. And even then, that was Red Bull Salzburg, the runaway leagues of the Austrian League, who behave more like a pseudo-German team and are largely viewed as a feeder club to Bundesliga outfit Red Bull Leipzig. Even more gallingly, Salzburg were thumped 8-3 by perennial German champions Bayern Munich in the aforementioned knockout tie in 2022. Since Austria were last represented in a European club final in 1996, a German team has won the Champions League 4 times. They have been represented 9 times in Champions League finals, and, in 2013, there was an all-German final in the Champions League. But, and it's a big but, the timeline of influence that ends with the caliber of elite-level managers such as Pep Guardiola, Jürgen Klopp, Thomas Tuchel, Luis Enrique, and Julian Nagelsmann has its roots more so in Austria than it ever has done in Germany. Yes, 3 of the aforementioned managers might be German, but their ideas aren't. Austria picked up style from the Scottish version of pass and move football. They, alongside teams like Dynamo Moscow, influenced the Hungarian national team of the 1954 World Cup, who in turn inspired the Ajax school of Vic Buckingham, Rinus Michels, and, later, Johan Cruyff. That is where we splinter off down 2 avenues, from the school of Pep Guardiola, Luis Enrique, and Xavi, directly from the Ajax route, and via Valery Lobanovsky's Dynamo Kyiv and Arrigo Sacchi's Milan, we have the Stuttgart School of Management, which boasts pupils such as Klopp, Tuchel, Nagelsmann, and large swaths of Red Bull managers, which in a weird little way brings us full circle back to Austria, doesn't it?